I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and for 16 years, I worked as a flight medic with SkyGuard Emergency Services in Denver, Colorado, or at least I did, until I submitted my resignation 4 months ago. During nearly 2 decades in emergency aviation medicine, I've responded to over 2,100 calls, everything from mountain rescues to highway disasters, cardiac emergencies, to trauma cases that would leave veteran paramedics shaken for weeks. But what I'm about to tell you about are 3 calls that didn't just test my medical skills, they fundamentally shattered everything I believed about life, death, and the boundaries between the two. These 3 cases invaded my dreams, destroyed my confidence in medicine, and ultimately forced me to abandon the career I'd devoted my entire adult life to. SkyGuard Emergency Services operates from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, just northwest of Denver, serving the entire Front Range corridor from Fort Collins down to Colorado Springs. We cover some of the most challenging terrain in the country: the Rocky Mountains, high-altitude wilderness areas, and urban environments, where altitude and weather can turn routine rescues into life-or-death situations. Our helicopters are state-of-the-art mobile intensive care units, equipped with everything from advanced cardiac monitoring to portable surgical suites that can perform emergency procedures at 12,000 feet. For the final 9 years of my career with SkyGuard, I flew as part of Team Alpha 7 with pilot Marcus Thompson and paramedic specialist Javier Santos. Marcus had been flying medical helicopters for 23 years, and Javier brought 14 years of critical care experience to our team. We called ourselves the Rocky Mountain Rescue Squad, and by 2019, we had developed one of the highest patient survival rates in Colorado's emergency medical system. I thought I had seen everything that emergency medicine could possibly present: climbers who survived falls that should have been instantly fatal, avalanche victims buried for hours, who walked away without permanent injury, car accident victims who lived through impacts that physics said were unsurvivable. In high-altitude emergency medicine, you learn to expect the unexpected and prepare for scenarios that textbooks say are impossible. But I was completely unprepared for what happened during 3 specific calls between October 2019 and March 2022. These weren't just medical anomalies or statistical outliers. They were events that challenged the very foundation of everything I thought I knew about consciousness, death, and what it means to be alive. Before joining SkyGuard, I completed my medical degree at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, followed by a residency in emergency medicine at Denver Health Medical Center. I spent 3 additional years specializing in wilderness medicine and high-altitude physiology, training that proved essential for the extreme environments we encountered in Colorado's backcountry. Flight medicine is unlike any other branch of emergency care. You're working in a confined space with limited resources, often in severe weather conditions, with patients whose conditions can change dramatically during transport. The altitude variations alone: we regularly flew from Denver at 5,280 feet to mountain locations above 10,000 feet, required constant adjustments to treatment protocols and equipment settings. During my tenure with SkyGuard, I participated in over 2,100 emergency responses: mountain climbing accidents, skiing injuries, wilderness emergencies, urban trauma, cardiac events, and every conceivable type of medical crisis that Colorado's diverse geography could produce. I'd seen hypothermia victims whose core body temperatures dropped so low they appeared clinically dead, but recovered completely. I'd treated altitude sickness cases where patients' oxygen saturation levels fell to numbers that should have resulted in immediate brain death. The human body's capacity for survival in extreme conditions had taught me to keep an open mind about what was medically possible, but nothing in my education or experience had prepared me for cases where the boundaries between life and death seemed to dissolve entirely. The first case that changed my perspective on everything occurred on October 17, 2019. It was a crisp autumn Thursday in the Colorado mountains, the kind of day when the aspen trees were turning golden and the first snow was dusting the peaks above timberline. At 2:23 p.m., Our emergency communication center received a priority 1 cardiac arrest call from Evergreen, a mountain community about 30 miles west of Denver. The initial dispatch information was straightforward. A 58-year-old woman named Catherine Blackwood had collapsed at her home on Meadowlark Lane while working in her garden. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Henley, had found Catherine unresponsive in her backyard and immediately called 911. The ground ambulance response time to the location was estimated at 22 minutes due to the winding mountain roads, so SkyGuard was dispatched for rapid medical intervention. Cardiac arrests in the mountains present unique challenges. The altitude, Evergreen sits at approximately 7,200 feet, affects both patient physiology and equipment performance. Lower oxygen pressure means that even healthy individuals can experience cardiac stress, and existing heart conditions are often exacerbated by the elevation. Additionally, the remote location meant that Catherine had likely been without medical attention for an extended period before discovery. Marcus fired up our Eurocopter EC-145, while Javier and I prepared our advanced cardiac life support equipment. Based on the dispatch information, witnessed cardiac arrest, unknown downtime, high altitude location, we were looking at a potentially viable save if we could reach the patient quickly and establish effective resuscitation protocols. The flight to Evergreen took 18 minutes, during which we reviewed our approach strategy. Catherine's house was located in a residential area with limited landing options, but Marcus had identified a small park about 2 blocks away that could accommodate our helicopter. From there, we would transport our equipment to the residence and assess the situation. As we approached the landing zone, I could see the ambulance staging area and several emergency vehicles already on scene. This was encouraging. It meant that ground personnel had arrived and potentially initiated basic life support measures. Every minute counts in cardiac arrest cases, and early intervention significantly improves survival odds. Marcus set us down in Meadowlark Park at 2:41 p.m. Javier and I immediately began unloading our cardiac emergency equipment, while Marcus secured the aircraft and prepared for rapid departure once we had the patient stabilized for transport. The park was only a 3-minute walk from Catherine's address, but carrying advanced life support equipment up mountain terrain, even in a residential area, requires careful planning and coordination. As we approached Catherine's house, a 2-story log home typical of the Evergreen area, I could see the emergency medical services staging area in the driveway. The ground ambulance crew, paramedics Scott Williams and Jennifer Lopez from Jefferson County EMS, met us at the front door with expressions I'd rarely seen in veteran emergency responders, confusion mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Dr. Rodriguez," Scott said as we reached the front steps, "we've got a situation here that doesn't make sense." The neighbor called in a cardiac arrest, and when we arrived we found the patient sitting at her kitchen table, completely alert and apparently healthy. This wasn't entirely unusual. False cardiac arrest calls happen occasionally. Someone faints or has a seizure, and witnesses mistake it for cardiac arrest. But Scott's expression suggested something more complicated than a simple misidentification. "Where's the patient now?" I asked, setting down my equipment bag. "That's the problem," Jennifer interrupted. "She's still sitting at the kitchen table, talking normally, asking us why we're here. But the neighbor, Mrs. Henley, insists she found Catherine collapsed in the backyard with no pulse and no breathing. Mrs. Henley says she performed CPR for about 5 minutes before we arrived." Javier looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Any medical history we should know about?" Scott consulted his notes. "According to the neighbor, Catherine has a history of heart disease. She had a major cardiac event about 2 years ago, spent a week in the ICU at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital. She's been on cardiac medication since then, but apparently doing well." We entered the house and immediately encountered what would become the most medically inexplicable situation of my career. Catherine Blackwood was indeed sitting at her kitchen table, appearing completely normal. She was a pleasant-looking woman with short gray hair, wearing gardening clothes, dirt-stained jeans, and a faded Colorado Rockies t-shirt. She was sipping tea, and seemed genuinely puzzled by the emergency response gathering in her home. "Hello, Dr. Rodriguez," Catherine said as I introduced myself. "I'm not sure why everyone is here. I was working in my garden, came inside to make some tea, and suddenly my house is full of paramedics. Did something happen to one of my neighbors?" I began my standard patient assessment. Catherine's vital signs were completely normal. Blood pressure 128/76, heart rate 72, and regular. Respiratory rate 16, oxygen saturation 98%, excellent for the altitude. Her cardiac monitor showed normal sinus rhythm with no arrhythmias or abnormalities. Neurologically, she was alert and oriented to person, place, and time. Her speech was clear, her memory appeared intact, and she showed no signs of confusion or distress. While I was conducting my medical assessment, Javier stepped outside to interview Mrs. Henley, the neighbor who had made the 911 call. What he learned from that conversation fundamentally challenged everything we thought we understood about the situation. Patricia Henley was a 72-year-old retired nurse who had lived next door to Catherine for 8 years. She was completely coherent, had no history of mental health issues, and her account of events was detailed and consistent. According to Mrs. Henley, she had gone to Catherine's back gate at approximately 2:10 p.m. to return a borrowed garden tool. "I found Catherine lying face down near her tomato plants," Mrs. Henley told Javier. "She wasn't breathing, and when I checked for a pulse, I couldn't find one. Her skin was already turning blue around her lips and fingernails. I immediately started CPR. I'm a retired ICU nurse, so I know what cardiac arrest looks like." Mrs. Henley described performing chest compressions and rescue breathing for about 5 minutes until the ambulance arrived. She insisted that Catherine had been clinically dead, no pulse, no spontaneous respirations, and showing early signs of cyanosis that indicated oxygen deprivation. When the paramedics arrived, Mrs. Henley continued, "I led them to the backyard where Catherine was still lying unconscious. But when we got there, she was gone. We found her a few minutes later, in her kitchen, making tea and acting like nothing had happened." Javier asked Mrs. Henley to show him exactly where she had found Catherine. In the backyard, near a row of tomato plants, there was a clear depression in the soil where a body had been lying. The earth was disturbed in a pattern consistent with someone performing CPR, heel marks from kneeling, compressed soil where chest compressions had been administered, and even some tear stains in the dirt where Mrs. Henley had been crying while trying to revive her neighbor. Most significantly, there were traces of blood in the soil when someone receives effective chest compressions. It's not uncommon for small amounts of blood to come up from the lungs or mouth, especially if the patient has been down for several minutes. Mrs. Henley confirmed that Catherine had expelled a small amount of blood during the resuscitation attempt, but Catherine Blackwood was sitting in her kitchen with no blood on her clothing, no dirt on her body, and no physical evidence that she had been lying unconscious in her garden just minutes earlier. As the senior medical officer on scene, I made the decision to transport Catherine to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital for comprehensive evaluation. Despite her apparent good health, the discrepancy between Mrs. Henley's account and Catherine's condition was too significant to ignore, and Catherine's cardiac history made any potential heart-related event a serious concern. Catherine agreed to the transport, though she continued to insist that she felt fine and couldn't understand the emergency response. "I suppose if Mrs. Henley thinks something happened, we should make sure everything is okay," she said with a slight smile. "She's been looking out for me since my heart attack 2 years ago." During the 12-minute flight to Presbyterian St. Joseph, I conducted continuous cardiac monitoring and repeated vital sign assessments. Catherine's condition remained stable throughout the transport, with no abnormalities in her heart rhythm, blood pressure, or neurological function. She engaged in normal conversation, asking about my background in flight medicine and commenting on the view of the mountains from the helicopter. but there were subtle details that troubled me during the transport. Catherine's clothes, which should have been dirty from gardening and potentially soiled from lying on the ground, were immaculate. Her hair, which should have been disheveled from Mrs. Henley's resuscitation efforts, was perfectly neat. Most puzzling, there was a faint sweet smell around Catherine, not perfume or soap, but something else I couldn't identify. At the hospital, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency department attending physician, conducted a thorough evaluation. Catherine's EKG showed normal sinus rhythm with no signs of recent cardiac injury or arrhythmia. Her cardiac enzymes, blood tests that would show elevation if she had suffered a heart attack, were completely normal. Chest X-rays, Connecticut scans, and comprehensive metabolic panels all came back within normal limits. But Dr. Mitchell made one discovery that added another layer of mystery to Catherine's case. Dr. Rodriguez, she called me aside after reviewing the test results. "I need to show you something strange. Catherine's medical records from her cardiac event 2 years ago indicate that she has a permanent pacemaker. But when we examined her today, there's no pacemaker present and no surgical scars to suggest one was ever implanted." I reviewed Catherine's medical history myself. The records clearly documented a massive heart attack in October 2017, followed by emergency surgery to implant a dual-chamber pacemaker due to significant damage to her heart's electrical conduction system. The device serial number was documented, surgical notes were detailed, and follow-up appointments confirmed proper pacemaker function. But Catherine Blackwood had no pacemaker. X-rays showed no foreign objects in her chest, and physical examination revealed no surgical scars. According to every test we could perform, Catherine had never had cardiac surgery of any kind. Dr. Mitchell contacted Catherine's cardiologist, Dr. James Patterson, who had performed the original pacemaker implantation. Dr. Patterson arrived at the hospital within an hour, bringing Catherine's complete cardiac file and his own memories of her case. "I remember Catherine very well," Dr. Patterson told us. "Hers was one of the most severe cardiac cases I've treated. She had a widowmaker heart attack, complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery. By the time she reached the hospital, she had been in cardiac arrest for over 20 minutes. We managed to revive her, but the damage to her heart muscle was extensive." Dr. Patterson described the surgical procedure in detail. Catherine's heart had been so damaged that a pacemaker was essential for survival. The device had been functioning normally at her most recent follow-up appointment just 6 months earlier. "But this is impossible," Dr. Patterson said after examining Catherine personally. "She has no pacemaker, no surgical scars, and her heart sounds completely normal. According to my examination today, Catherine has never had a heart attack. Her cardiac function is that of a healthy 40-year-old, not someone who suffered massive cardiac damage 2 years ago." The medical records were indisputable. Catherine's original hospital admission, surgical notes, device implantation records, insurance claims, and follow-up appointments were all thoroughly documented. But the physical evidence contradicted everything in her medical file. Dr. Patterson requested immediate access to Catherine's original cardiac catheterization films, the imaging studies that had shown the massive blockage in her coronary artery. When the films were retrieved from the hospital's archives, they showed something that left all of us speechless. Catherine's coronary arteries were completely normal, with no signs of blockage, scarring, or previous cardiac damage. The films were dated October 15, 2017, and matched Catherine's patient identification number perfectly. But they showed the heart of someone who had never experienced any cardiac problems. As word of Catherine's case spread through the hospital, other staff members who had been involved in her original treatment came forward with their own memories and concerns. Nurse Rebecca Torres, who had been part of Catherine's ICU team during her 2017 admission, remembered the case clearly. "Catherine was one of our miracle patients," Rebecca told me. "She came in basically dead. We worked on her for almost 40 minutes before getting her back. She spent 8 days in the ICU, and we all thought we were going to lose her several times. But she pulled through, and her recovery was remarkable. Rebecca described Catherine's week-long hospital stay in detail, including specific conversations they had shared, and Catherine's gradual improvement following the pacemaker implantation. But when Rebecca examined Catherine in the emergency department, she was troubled by something she couldn't quite articulate. "Dr. Rodriguez, this is definitely Catherine Blackwood. I recognize her face, her voice, even her sense of humor. But something is different. She looks younger, somehow, healthier, like the cardiac damage never happened." Other staff members, who had treated Catherine in 2017, had similar reactions. They recognized her as their former patient, but were disturbed by her apparent perfect health and the absence of any signs of her previous cardiac trauma. The hospital's medical records department conducted a comprehensive audit of Catherine's file to determine if there had been some kind of administrative error or case of mistaken identity. But every piece of documentation confirmed that this was indeed Catherine Blackwood, the same patient who had suffered massive cardiac damage and received a pacemaker 2 years earlier. Social security records, insurance information, driver's license data, and even dental records all matched perfectly. There was no possibility of mistaken identity or administrative error. After 8 hours of testing and evaluation, Catherine was cleared for discharge. Every medical examination had confirmed that she was in perfect health, with no signs of cardiac disease or any other medical problems. Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson were both baffled by the contradiction between Catherine's documented medical history and her current physical condition, but there was no medical justification for keeping her in the hospital. Catherine's sister, Margaret Walsh, arrived at the hospital to drive her home. Margaret had been present during Catherine's original cardiac event and could verify the details of her sister's medical history. But when Margaret saw Catherine in the emergency department, her reaction was immediate and disturbing. "Catherine, you look wonderful," Margaret said, embracing her sister. "You look better than you have since before your heart attack. Actually, you look better than you've looked in years. How is that possible?" Margaret confirmed every detail of Catherine's 2017 cardiac event. She had been the one to find Catherine collapsed in her home, had ridden in the ambulance to the hospital, and had spent days at Catherine's bedside during her ICU stay. She remembered the pacemaker surgery, the slow recovery, and Catherine's ongoing cardiac medications. But looking at her now, Margaret told me privately, it's like the heart attack never happened. She has color in her cheeks, her energy seems completely restored, and she's not taking any of her cardiac medications. I don't understand what's going on. As Catherine was preparing to leave the hospital, she made one comment that would haunt me for months afterward. She approached me as I was completing her discharge paperwork and said, "Dr. Rodriguez, I want to thank you for taking such good care of me today. I know this situation must seem strange to you and the other doctors." "Catherine," I replied, "do you remember your heart attack 2 years ago? Do you remember the surgery and your recovery?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I remember being very sick," she said slowly. "I remember feeling like I was going somewhere far away, and it was peaceful and warm. But then I came back, and when I came back, everything was different. Better." "What do you mean by came back?" I asked. "I don't know how to explain it, Dr. Rodriguez, but I don't think I was really here for a while, and when I returned, it was like I brought something back with me, something that made me whole again." Catherine left the hospital that evening with her sister, but the medical mystery surrounding her case was far from resolved. Dr. Patterson initiated a comprehensive review of her case with colleagues at University of Colorado Hospital and National Jewish Health, hoping to find some medical explanation for the disappearance of her pacemaker and the apparent reversal of her cardiac damage. Over the following weeks, I found myself unable to stop thinking about Catherine's case. The contradiction between her documented medical history and her current physical condition challenged everything I understood about cardiac medicine and the permanence of heart damage. I reached out to Mrs. Henley, the neighbor who had found Catherine in her garden, to see if she had any additional insights into what had happened that October afternoon. Mrs. Henley remained absolutely certain about what she had witnessed. Catherine had been clinically dead in her backyard, and she had performed CPR for several minutes before the emergency responders arrived. Dr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Henley told me during our phone conversation, "I've been a nurse for over 40 years. I know what death looks like, and Catherine was dead. Not unconscious, not in some kind of coma. She was dead. No pulse, no breathing, no response to stimulation. I've seen enough cardiac arrests to know the difference." Mrs. Henley also mentioned something she hadn't told the other emergency responders. When I was performing CPR on Catherine, just before the ambulance arrived, I could have sworn I heard her say something. It was very faint, like a whisper, but it sounded like she said, "Not yet, I'm not ready yet." But her lips weren't moving, and she still had no pulse. I asked Mrs. Henley if she had noticed anything unusual about Catherine in the months since the incident. Her response added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable case. "Catherine seems different now," Mrs. Henley said, "not in a bad way, but renewed somehow. She's been working in her garden more than ever, and her flowers are growing like nothing I've ever seen. It's almost November, and her roses are still blooming like it's the middle of summer, and she seems to have this effect on people now. Everyone who spends time with her comes away feeling better, healthier, more hopeful." Catherine's case remained active in my mind throughout the winter of 2019 and into early 2020. I consulted with cardiac specialists, reviewed medical literature on spontaneous cardiac recovery, and even reached out to researchers studying near-death experiences and unexplained medical phenomena, but no amount of research or consultation could provide a rational explanation for what had happened to Catherine Blackwood. Her pacemaker had simply vanished without a trace. Her cardiac damage had apparently healed completely, leaving no scars or evidence of previous injury, and her documented death and resurrection in her backyard remained medically impossible, according to everything I had learned during my career. The case began to affect my approach to other emergency calls. I found myself questioning my own medical assessments and wondering if there were aspects of life and death that medical science hadn't yet discovered or understood. The certainty I had always felt about the boundaries between life and death began to erode, replaced by a growing awareness that there might be forces and phenomena beyond the scope of conventional medicine. What I didn't realize was that Catherine's case was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, I would encounter 2 more situations that would push the boundaries of medical possibility even further, ultimately forcing me to confront the possibility that everything I thought I knew about consciousness, death, and the nature of human existence might be fundamentally incomplete. 14 months after Catherine Blackwood's impossible recovery, on December 8, 2020, we received what appeared to be a routine mountain rescue call. A 29-year-old rock climber named Vincent Hawthorne had fallen approximately 200 feet while attempting a technical climb in Rocky Mountain National Park. Ground rescue teams had reached him after a 3-hour recovery operation and confirmed that he had died from massive trauma injuries. But when SkyGuard was called in to transport Vincent's body from the remote location, we discovered something that would make Catherine's case seem almost reasonable by comparison. Vincent Hawthorne was not only alive, he was conscious, alert, and asking about his climbing gear. According to the rescue team's documentation, Vincent had been dead for over 2 hours. His body temperature had dropped to match the ambient air, rigor mortis had begun to set in, and he had shown no vital signs during the entire rescue operation. Yet when we arrived to transport what we thought would be a body, we found a living, breathing patient, who had no memory of falling and no injuries consistent with a 200-foot fall onto granite rocks. The Vincent Hawthorne case, and the third incident that finally ended my career in flight medicine, would reveal something far more disturbing than medical impossibilities. They would suggest that the boundary between life and death might not be as permanent as medicine teaches us to believe. December 8, 2020, Vincent Hawthorne, a 29-year-old rock climber, had fallen 200 feet from the diamond face of Long's Peak. Ground rescue teams confirmed he was dead. No pulse, no breathing, body temperature matching the 12 degrees Fahrenheit air. He'd been deceased for over 2 hours when we arrived for body recovery, but as we prepared our equipment, Vincent sat up on the ledge and called down, "Hey, is someone there? I think I might need some help getting down from here." Every rescue specialist froze in shock. Captain Torres had personally checked for vital signs multiple times. Vincent had been dead. When I reached him, Vincent was completely uninjured despite the 200-foot fall. Perfect vital signs, no broken bones, no trauma whatsoever. But what he told me sent chills down my spine. "I had the strangest dream," Vincent said. "I was floating above the mountain, watching all of you work down here. I could see a person lying on this ledge, and everyone was treating him like he was dead, but I was floating above it all, watching everything happen." Vincent had described our rescue operation from an aerial perspective, a perspective he could only have had if his consciousness had somehow been observing from above while his body lay motionless. "I could hear everything," he continued. "When Captain Torres was checking my pulse, I wanted to tell her I was okay, but I couldn't. Then something started pulling me back down, like a voice saying it wasn't time yet, and suddenly I was back in my body." At the hospital, Dr. Robert Kim found no evidence of trauma or oxygen deprivation. Vincent's blood chemistry showed his body had been in some kind of suspended hibernation state for 2 hours, then rapidly resumed normal function. March 15, 2022, Isabella Chen, a 42-year-old woman, had been in cardiac arrest for over 90 minutes when we received the transport call. By every medical standard, she was dead, and had been dead for well over an hour. During our flight to Denver, we maintained futile resuscitation efforts for her desperate family, but 20 minutes into the flight, Isabella opened her eyes and said, "Where am I? Why does my chest hurt?" Isabella was not only conscious, she was completely alert. Normal heart rhythm, perfect blood pressure, oriented and aware. She described being in a bright, warm place with deceased relatives. "My mother was there. She died when I was 16, Isabella told me. She said it wasn't my time yet, that I needed to go back to take care of my family. I could see my body, lying on the kitchen floor, watched the doctors working on me in the emergency room, but I wasn't scared." At Denver Health, every test confirmed the impossible. Isabella had recovered completely from clinical death, with no neurological damage. Her brain showed no signs of oxygen deprivation, despite being without circulation for 90 minutes. These 3 cases shattered my ability to practice medicine. Catherine's reversed heart damage, Vincent's documented death and resurrection, Isabella's recovery from extended cardiac arrest. They all raised horrifying questions. How many patients had I pronounced dead, who might have been experiencing what Vincent and Isabella described, conscious awareness outside their bodies? How many families had I counseled about hopelessness when cases like Catherine's proved documented medical damage could reverse itself? I found myself questioning every death pronouncement, spending excessive time on futile resuscitations, unable to provide families with definitive information. The certainty I needed for emergency medicine had been replaced by paralyzing doubt about the nature of life and death itself. 6 months after Isabella's case, I attempted 45 minutes of aggressive resuscitation on a clearly deceased motorcycle accident victim, traumatizing his family and compromising our emergency response capability. Marcus and Javier had to convince me to stop. I knew I could no longer function as a flight medic. I submitted my resignation on July 18, 2022. Catherine, Vincent and Isabella had fundamentally altered my understanding of consciousness and death in ways that made continued emergency practice impossible. Since leaving flight medicine, I've stayed in contact with all three patients. They remain in perfect health, with no recurrence of their original conditions. More significantly, all three report enhanced intuition, the ability to sense others' health issues, and complete lack of fear about death. Dying was the most peaceful experience of my life, Isabella told me recently. Death isn't an ending, it's just a transition. Knowing that has made living so much richer. These cases taught me that medicine operates within significant limitations when understanding consciousness and death. The assumption that death is always final, that consciousness depends entirely on brain function, might be incomplete. I don't pretend to understand what happened to Catherine, Vincent, and Isabella, but I know what I witnessed fundamentally changed not only them but everyone present during their impossible recoveries. The line between life and death might be far more permeable than we realize. Consciousness might extend beyond physical brain function in ways current medical science cannot detect. And sometimes, the most honest response to the impossible is acknowledging there are profound mysteries in life and death we're only beginning to understand. These three cases ended my career in flight medicine, but they opened my awareness to possibilities that make existence infinitely more mysterious and meaningful than I ever imagined.